Prosocial skills are children's interest or inclination in helping others. Prosocial development shouldn't be treated as this abstract textbook notion, this antiquated thing that we have 5 scales for, or anything like that. It should just be understood as a natural inclination we have to help another person. Recent evidence suggests to us that prosocial behaviors emerge quite early. So even with obstacles, children who are only a year old, a year and a half, show a strong interest in helping others. So if you show them someone who's reaching for a container that's up high on a shelf and out of reach, or someone who's dropped a can of pencils, they will climb over obstacles in order to help that person. And they show those behaviors by 14 months of age. In that second year of life, you'll see the first signs of prosocial behavior typically in response to distress. So, and this is a lot of anecdotal kind of evidence. So for example, if a toddler, an 18-month-old or a 2-year-old, sees someone crying, they'll give their own attachment object up to that child, right? So the blanket's offered, or the teddy bear is offered. There's even someone on record who picked up their own little T-shirt to show their tummy because they know that that's the kind of thing that makes another person laugh. So those are all, before they can say very much, these are examples of these very creative ways that young children reach out and extend help to others. When they're more verbal, by the time they're, say, 2.5, 3 years of age, they can start communicating their own needs, and they can respond helpfully to someone who articulates their needs to them, their others' needs to them. So those are some of that's our understanding for at least how prosocial behaviors emerge in early childhood. It's not clear that children are born with those skills, but they are born with the potential to develop them very naturally. But it requires another person to do it. So the role of relationships, and intimate ones, sensitive ones, would be central. For the child to both see how helping behaviors are modeled in another person, and they're then also given repeated opportunities in that stable relationship to showcase their own helping behaviors. If that relationship fosters good behaviors, prosocial behaviors, then you can expect to see that emerge and fostered in the child. If children do not get what they need from the environment or from the conditions around them, or worse, if the conditions around them are difficult and perpetuate high levels of stress or toxic stress, environments where you don't see a lot of prosocial behavior among the adults or between other adults and children, or environments where your main goal is to protect yourself and your needs first. You shouldn't expect to see prosocial natures flourish. So difficult environments that result from neglect or abuse or even violence can expose children to these high levels of stress, which we know affect the skills that are required to develop the prosocial abilities that we're talking about. If you see in the environment that when there's another person or another child or a sibling in need, if you see the child, for example, show no concern or withdraw, and to do that repeatedly, you might mention that. You might talk to a clinician or a pediatrician about that. If you see the child get overly concerned, extremely distressed in the face of another person's distress, and a kind of dependence on a caregiver to calm them down in response to someone else's distress, you might also mention behaviors like that to a professional. And also, sometimes you'll see children strike out. So if in response to a child who's a distress in the environment, a sibling or a friend. Some children think that the best solution to that situation is to shut it down. So they might actually act out to solve the problem. Maybe they've seen situations solved that way before. Who knows? That would be another thing to reach out to a professional about. All children do all the things I just mentioned. So even in typical development, there's enormous variation, and every child could show any one of the things that I just talked about. They could be withdrawn, they could be overly dependent, hyper concerned, and they might even act out or strike out. What you're watching out for is a child who kind of consistently shows some maladaptive set of behaviors in these early years, between say 0 and 3, in a way that you notice. Where you don't necessarily, if you see some balance of helping and these maladaptive, that's great. You should take a lot of pride and joy in the good stuff you're seeing, because they really are working things out and they need the time and the latitude to do it. But if you are seeing more confusion and a range of maladaptive behaviors, or even one of them over and over again, and you're not seeing as much as of the spontaneous helping we've talked about, then that's the kind of, I think that's, and you see that in the early years, that's the time to talk to someone about it. So I think very early on, in the first, say, year or two, even though there are these inclinations to help, the culture's there to mold, shape, and encourage the development of those behaviors. So very early on, it might help to simply encourage, even instruct, and then to praise the helping behaviors that you see. So for example, if someone needs help and your toddler's distracted, right, you can simply say, they can be overtly directed and told, can you help your brother find his toy? Or your sister's crying, can you give a hug? And then you can follow up with giving lots of praise, like, good job, thank you, that was great, she feels so much better. Early on in the first 2 years, we think that that actually can increase rates of prosocial behavior. Those are effective. But by the time the child is 3, it may be that those same prompts are no longer needed. Okay? So instead, now that the child is 3, their language skills are up and running, now what you find helps is more indirect mention of what the needs are in the situation. So you don't have to tell your 3-year-old what to do, although praise, I think, is always good throughout life. You don't have to overtly instruct her what to do, but you might say, so-and-so seems to need a cookie, or so-and-so can't seem to find her toy. Could you help? So just if they can't make the right inference or observe what the need seems to be in that situation, all you have to do is point out what that need seems to be, and they seem to have an appropriate response ready. So those are some of the ways in which parents, caregivers, and teachers can adjust the support they give. Starting, very early on, you can simply say, here's what's needed. And later on, you can just point out what the different needs are in the situation that they're in. And let the child, come up with the appropriate response. Other ways adults can facilitate the development of pro-social behavior is by establishing routines, right? Finding ways to model your own good behaviors, your own pro-social actions, inattentive behaviors, and by maintaining these supportive, reliable relationships. So one main message about pro-social behavior is that kids really are natural. They're natural helpers. There's some natural instinct, altruistic instinct that they have in there. And so if you can find ways to involve them in your life, let's say you've got little tasks that need doing, right? And there's some easy way they can contribute, they love it. They love it. Our culture has ways of putting children here and adults here, right? It starts early. We love to put ourselves in like the teacher role, and the child is the student, and set up these kind of pedagogical relationships with our children. That's very Western. It's how we do it. But other cultures, I think, have real lessons for us where infants and children are kind of right there in daily life from the start. And they're learning from everything people are doing. They're amazing in observing and at helping when needed. So if we can kind of harness that natural inclination to help by giving them things to help with, and they're not just looking to play all day, they're really looking to do stuff. And you can give them realistic things on task. They love it. You'll really, it'll be something that you're doing together, and then they also get that added benefit of the accomplishment that comes with doing something and doing something with someone else. The families that are doing this work and that are making homes for these children are often the busiest families. They're the hardest working families. And so you might wonder, how are they to respond to someone who's been through a couple of difficult environments and are now placed in my home, given how much I have to do, given the other children who also have needs that I'm responsible for. And I've always been a big believer as a parent and as a researcher in the value of even short, concentrated bouts of attention on the child. So even if it's only 10 minutes or 15 minutes, that's all you've got. That's all you've got in an entire day, maybe. And you're not fresh. Maybe you don't even have a lot that you can give. You don't have a lot of things to say. You've just put in your own 12-hour day, right? I still think that if all you do is whatever your child is doing, whatever their age, they're 3, they're 5, they're 8, they're doing homework, they're playing with blocks, whatever, and anything in between. If you can simply attend to them, if that just means watching them, making a comment here or there that describes what they're doing, and doing that for some concentrated period, you will have done something to build interpersonal trust with that person, with that child. And that attention that you've given, that really isolated, focused attention you've just given, is a pro-social behavior, right? You've just modeled some sustained attention on what you're doing. So that's just a little piece of advice of what it can seem like a very difficult thing to do at the end of a long day when who knows what other things need doing. But it's just 10, 15 minutes, and it's just attention. It doesn't have to be much else. It doesn't have to be even the book if you don't want to read the book, or it's just looking at them and commenting on what they're doing. That goes a long, long way. In this digital age, with all the technological advances that we have that advance all the things we can do, even our communication with others, and the support it gives to our children in all kinds of ways, it's important to keep in mind that these same devices are the kinds of things that interrupt or have the capacity to interrupt our interpersonal relationships. So to the extent that trust is developed in relationships and time spent between children and their caregivers, children and their friends, children and their siblings, and pro-social behavior emerges in the context of these very same relationships, it's important to keep in mind that the devices can replace it. They can interrupt the time the valuable time that's needed to build those relationships. So I don't have any very specific advice. For example, I leave it to the parents to monitor screen time for their children. But the one thing I would emphasize is when you place limits on screen time for kids, which is great, the things we've been talking about here today argue for spending time when the screen's put away, even if it's just for 10 minutes, even if it's for 15 minutes. So one reason to have screen limits is so that the child can get attention from you in whatever form for a little while. And a little while goes a long way. You're not doomed if you come from a difficult background. The first years are important, but it's not as if they lay some blueprint for the future that can't be changed, right? The brain is constantly adapting and responding to whatever new experiences the child encounters. And a foster parent, for example, has the opportunity to be that new experience. Many of us put a lot of stock in the transformative power of interpersonal relationships as a kind of protective factor, some might say, but also as a real mechanism of change going forward. So if you found yourself in a difficult environment, even an isolated environment, a neglectful one, even a violent one, and we ask, well, how could you ever overcome the odds that those situations laid for you? Psychologists would point to two things. First, the brain that's always ready to rewire based on new experiences. And secondly, some of the most important forms that experience can take come in the form of interpersonal relationships, conversations with others, discussions with others, question asking, and dialogue. Relationships with other people have the power to transform and repair.